Welcome everyone to tonight's meeting of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee. Before we commence the meeting, I request that all mobile telephones are turned off or switched to silent. Thanks very much. My name is Councillor Westholt and I chair this committee meeting, and I will start by introducing my fellow councillors. To the left of the horseshoe table is Councillor Jim Park, Councillor Felicity Sinfield, our Deputy Mayor, Councillor Nick Stavro, Councillor Lisa Hollingsworth, our Mayor, Councillor Di Gillies. On the other side of the table is Councillor Cynthia Watson, Councillor Gary Thompson, Councillor Jane Addis, Councillor Susan Bicker, and Councillor Victor Franco. I also acknowledge Senior Governance and Integrity Officer Liam Merrifield, who will be guiding us all tonight, and Director of Urban Living, Mr. Scott Walker. There are other councillors with us, council officers with us tonight, and they'll be introduced as they present. As a general introduction, the Urban Planning Delegated Committee meeting is being live streamed on Council's YouTube to enable public viewing tonight. The meeting will also be recorded and will be made available again on Council's YouTube as soon as practicable after the meeting. The primary purpose of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee is to deal with issues under the Planning and Environment Act and the Building Act. This committee has delegated authority to make decisions on behalf of Council. For those presenting the evening, when it comes to the item in the agenda, and there is only one tonight, as you know, it will be introduced by an officer. I will then call upon you one by one to come forward and join us at the horseshoe table. If you are making a submission, please present your viewpoint clearly and concisely on why you support or oppose the item. Please do not repeat what earlier speakers have said, and keep the submission focused on relevant issues and points not previously raised. If you oppose the item, please tell the committee why you disagree, and maybe suggest an alternative approach that would satisfy your concerns. Please focus on your concerns rather than matters of history or details in the officer's report. There is a strict 3-minute limit for each speaker, including councillors, and whilst I chair this meeting and can vary this, we seldom do. At the 2.5 minute mark, we will ring the bell to indicate that you've really only 30 seconds left to complete your presentation. For those in the gallery this evening, I would like to take this opportunity to remind you to extend due courtesy and respect to each other and to the committee as a whole, and refrain from inappropriate behaviour. This includes remaining quiet while other speakers are addressing the meeting and not disrupting the decision-making process of the committee. You may only address the council when the chair advises you can do so, and we will give that direction as appropriate. Where members of the community disrupt or fail to comply with these directions, they can be removed from the meeting. And just to finish, I would like to encourage all submitters, officers and councillors to speak directly into the microphone so that we can all hear what's going on. I now move to apologies. Mr. Merrifield, are there any apologies this evening?
Through you, Chair, there are no apologies this evening.
Thank you. I'll now move to adoption and confirmation of the meeting of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee held on the 16th of September this year. Councillors, can I please have a motion to adopt these minutes? It's not working. I'll go by analogue. Councillor Sinfield, your light's on.
I'm happy to move that.
Thank you. Do we have a seconder? Councillor Gillies.
Seconded, thank you, Chair.
Thanks very much. Is anyone opposed? Fantastic. I will now put that motion. All of those in favour? Thanks very much. Declaration of conflicts of interest. Councillors, council officers, are there any conflicts of interest that you wish to foreshadow from matters on tonight's agenda? There are none, thank you. We will now move to the body of the meeting, item 3.1, and this is, of course, as you would know from reading the agenda for this evening tonight, this is not a normal UPDC meeting. We're really looking at some items that have been sent to us by state government. We're also looking at a submission we made to state government some time ago, it's already gone, and a second one which we have made, but it also needs endorsement. So any comments you have to make tonight, if you view it in that light. So tonight we have 6 members of the gallery wishing to make submissions, 5 in support and 1 against. Once I've announced your name, please sit at the top of the horseshoe table. If a submitter is not present when the name is called, we'll move directly on to the next speaker. I remind submitters that there is a strict 3-minute limit. Please commence your submission to us with your name and the suburb in which you reside. We will start tonight with Mr. Sorry?
Do the presentation first.
Oh, right. God, I was trying to skip you.
Thanks, Chair. I'm happy to introduce the item and then we'll move to the speakers. And there's quite a bit of material that I'll just cover off in introducing this item, and it might set a bit of context and assist some of the speakers that will come later on. So tonight's report seeks to inform councillors and on the additional documentation released for the Victorian Government's Activity Centre program, and in particular the draft Camberwell Junction Activity Centre plan. And this documentation is contained in attachments 1 to 3, as well as the submissions lodged by Council on the draft Camberwell Junction Activity Centre plan, that's attachment 4, and proposed planning scheme controls, that is at attachment 5. The report also seeks endorsement of this submission on the planning scheme controls. We know it's difficult for the community and council to fully comprehend all of the significant changes to planning in response to the housing statement from September last year that are underway or proposed, as much of the consultation is limited to certain stakeholders and confined to very short overlapping timeframes. This is also occurring at a difficult time for council at the moment to communicate with the community given the formal election period. The overlapping proposals, which are underway and will impact Camberwell Junction Activity Centre, are outlined in a diagram at figure 1 on page 8 of the report. And we will just bring up that diagram now. And I'd like to step through each of these so that I can set a bit more of the background as to what is happening and where tonight's report and submission fits in. So I'll bring up that Gantt chart now, and if anyone in the gallery would like a hard copy of that, we have some large hard copies on the front table here. The draft Camberwell Activity Centre, or the draft Camberwell Junction Activity Centre plan was prepared by the Victorian Planning Authority and was released by the state government on the 22nd of August 2022. And that's the first line on that plan. If we'll just stick to the Gantt chart for a moment. That's the first line on that plan, the Activity Centre plan. It was released on the 22nd of August. And officers presented a report on this plan at the UPDC meeting on the 3rd of September, where it was resolved to lodge a submission. And that submission was finalised and submitted on the 26th of September. They were due by the 29th of September, and that's included attachment 4 for your information. And this Activity Centre plan was a high-level plan which referenced the Council's Camberwell Junction Structure and Place Plan and flagged a new, previously not flagged, 800-metre walkable catchment extending beyond the Activity Centre to support development up to 6 storeys. But the plan overall was very light on detail. So shortly before the submissions were due on that plan, a draft Camberwell Junction Activity Centre plan, due on that plan, the Victorian Government released additional documentation in support of proposed planning scheme changes, and these changes were emailed to Council on the 20th of September and only provided to officers of the 10 Activity Centre councils and not made publicly available. And a request was made by the VPA and Department of Transport and Planning for councils to provide feedback on that draft head provision by the 4th of October. That was last Friday. So that meant that Council was finalising its submission by 29th of September on the overall Activity Centre plan, and at the same time having to prepare a report a week later, or a submission a week later, on the specific head provisions for the Activity Centre. And that head provision is interesting. So what you'll see in the attachments 1 to 3 tonight is a draft walkable catchment zone planning provisions at attachment 1, a draft new built form overlay head provision, and it's only the head part of it. It's not the schedule for the Camberwell Activity Centre, which would have the detail of how it would apply at a place like Camberwell. That's not yet available. So that head provision is at attachment 2. And the thing about this head provision, which is important to understand, is this is the model of planning scheme control, the walkable catchment zone and this built form overlay, that is intended to apply to 130 activity centres across Melbourne in the future. So, as one of the 10 affected activity centres at Camberwell and a council responsible for that activity centre, we are in effect providing comment on a new planning scheme provision that will apply across all of Melbourne that the other councils have not been given an opportunity to comment on. There's also draft changes to Clause 58, apartment developments, including a range of new development standards, and that's at attachment 3. Also released are 2 background reports, and they have been made available on the VicGov Engage website, where the activity centre controls are outlined and consultation is underway. However, they were only made available last week. And they are very difficult to find on that website, I must say. And there's, those 2 documents are a City of Centres background report providing the strategic basis for typology-based built form controls translated into the new proposed built form overlay. So essentially the background as to how they were able to build up the approach that they plan on using for the built form overlay, and an urban design background summary report. And whilst this report is not directly relevant for Camberwell Junction, it absolutely may be relevant and will be relevant to Burundar in the future, as additional centres such as Kew Junction and Glen Ferry will be brought into the Activity Centre program. As I mentioned earlier, we do not yet have the specific schedule to the built form control for Camberwell Activity Centre, and we are advised by the VPA, the Victorian Planning Authority, that they are working towards providing that to the councils by the 11th of October. But we do not know how long we will have to comment on that schedule. And it is only when we receive this that we will know if there are any major concerns with the translation of the Camberwell Junction structure and place plan into the proposed planning controls. So essentially, what you have there, the first 3 items on that Gantt chart, is the overall Activity Centre plan, submissions due by 29th of September, the Activity Centre head controls, submissions due by 4th of October, which we're asking you to endorse this evening, and then a future schedule that we don't have yet, and we don't know what that's going to say, which collectively forms the planning controls that will apply to the Camberwell Activity Centre, but also provide the model of controls that applies to 130 activity centres across Melbourne in the future. We've also got on that Gantt chart there the proposed changes to Res Code that were outlined in a UPDC report on 16th of September 2024, and only select council officers from select councils and other industry stakeholders were notified on the 27th of August of those proposed changes with submissions required by the 11th of September. So I think that was 7 or 8 business days that those submissions were due. The amendment seeks to change the operation of Clause 54 and 55, Res Code, making all standards deemed to comply. In other words, if the standard is met, then the proposal must be approved. It also introduces new Res Code standards, deletes some standards and amends others. And there's significant impact on neighbourhood character and how that is viewed and approached, and would also remove third-party VCAT appeal rights for objectors if a project is deemed to comply. And the changes to Res Code are expected by the end of October based on previous indications to councils. However, this has not been confirmed by the Department of Transport and Planning. So we've got the Department of Transport Planning undertaking the process for the Res Code changes, the VPA undertaking the process for the activity centres, the VPA indicating that, oh, well, the changes for the activity centres at places like Camberwell will not change the third-party rights for objectors, but if the Res Code changes come in, the combination of those layering upon each other means that for residential developments under Res Code within that activity centre and the walkable catchment will result in the third party being removed. So we can see the overlapping nature then of these sorts of changes and how they impact on a place like Camberwell. We then have Plan for Victoria, which submissions have closed on, and all of these changes are proposed to be finalised and brought into the planning system and announced in December of this year. There's another list there of other changes to the planning scheme that have been flagged as being introduced by December as well, but with no formal consultation period beyond previous high-level consultations that have already happened, including car parking provisions last year, open space infrastructure contributions, as loosely referenced in the activity centre plan, engage work, affordable housing, and environmental sustainable design requirements. And these are also expected to be announced in December, but we have no formal indications of any consultation around the actual controls or makeup of those controls. All the changes that I've just outlined in combination will significantly alter the way planning works in Melbourne, and specifically for Camberwell Junction Activity Centre in the first instance, as one of the lead activity centres. We just move to the next slide now. I just want to recap and show the map of the Camberwell Activity Centre with the core area there in blue and the walkable catchment area outlined in purple. It shows the extent of that area that is caught within that 800-metre catchment. The key issues raised in our submission on the draft head provisions for the activity centre that were submitted on Friday, and we're seeking your endorsement from you this evening. The key issues that we have raised include the continued opposition to the proposed new walkable catchment zone with the intention to facilitate increased housing and scale within 800-metre walkable catchment of the activity centre, and particular concern about its relationship to existing heritage overlays. We have indicated general support for a built form overlay of some form, but significant concerns about the detailed drafting of the head provision and the lack of relationship between outcomes and standards, the lack of detail and guidance in many of the standards, and uncertainty over the new value capture framework and public open space contribution system indicated in that head provision. We indicated opposition to the proposed Clause 58 apartment development standards, and also concern about the methodology used and strategic justification to develop standardised built form controls to be used in all activity centres in the future without proper local contextual design responses for each of those activity centres. So I hope that outlines a little bit of the context of where this report this evening fits into the broader picture and thank you for bearing with me as I took you through that. Christian Wilson, our Coordinator Strategic Planning, and myself are here to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. We'll now... Thank you. We'll now go to public submissions. I call upon Ian Hundley to join us at the table. Thanks very much. I'm sure I don't have to remind you, 3-minute limit, and start with your name and the suburb in which you live. Thanks very much.
Okay. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, councillors. My name's Ian Hundley and I live in Balwyn North. The speed with which these matters are being dealt with, as demanded by the Victorian Government, is unreasonable. This needs to be said. Maybe it has, but there is no harm in repeating it. There is an element of panic to it, either real or contrived. How can residents get their mind around it all? They cannot, of course. My view is the council should go macro in its response, and I've got a few things to suggest here. First relates to population policy. As far as I know, the state government doesn't have a population policy. Whilst this may be thought to be the responsibility of the Commonwealth, and it is as far as the size and composition of net migration is concerned, it is equally true that the subnational impacts at state and local levels can be substantial, as we are now finding. It is also important to put things, I think, by the Council in a historical perspective. The Victorian Government is seeking to increase the number of dwellings in Boroondara as a whole, not just in Camberwell, but as a whole, from 74,300 or 600 by an additional 67,000 by the year 2051. To put that into context, that means a net increase in the number of dwellings in the next 28 years of about 90% of that which was managed in the previous 190 years or so. There is no consideration I could find of climate change effects in the built environment and what the government proposes to do in achieving the objective of a 30% canopy tree cover. The government has apparently said things about canopy cover in the western and northern suburbs, which has a number against it, where residents are starting to fry because of the combined effects of climate change and a rapidly expanding built environment, which is not fit for purpose. But nothing about the rest of Melbourne as far as I know, including Camberwell. There's been a lot of talk about the absence of infrastructure. Council should highlight the cost blowouts of big build projects in or near Boroondara, many of which are poised to have a negative contribution, including the North East Link project, which in the nature of road projects is very space extensive. The Victorian Treasurer appears to believe that population growth will absorb these costs by averaging them across a larger population, which is ridiculous. And finally, I think it would be worthwhile for the Council to draw attention to the words of the Victorian Government's Planning Minister, Richard Wynne, or former Planning Minister Richard Wynne, in March 2017, when he released a media statement saying, quote, unquote, saving the backyard and boosting livability, where, amongst other things, he purported to say that under new rules, blocks between 400 to 500 square metres require a 25% minimum garden area, blocks between 500 and 600 square metres 30%, and blocks larger than that have a 35% garden area.
Thank you, Mr. Hadley. Can you mind wrapping up now? Thank you, Mayor.
Yes, thanks very much. That's pretty much all I have to say. As I say, these are historical words, but I think our government needs to be reminded of them.
Councillors, are there any questions of this presenter tonight? There are none. Thank you very much. Yep. Sorry, Mr. Hudley, if you wouldn't mind, we do have a question. If you'd mind returning to your seat, that'd be great.
Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Stavro.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Huntley, you noted that you don't think they have the state government has a population policy, but there are indications that they're assuming a certain population growth to be looking at these targets. Have you have any thoughts around that and what numbers they are projecting?
Well, thanks, Councillor. Well, the numbers that I've seen in past years have basically been described as projections, not a policy ambition. And I can only assume that that's continued to be followed. Yeah.
I see. So your point is that they haven't thought it through. It's not a deep enough analysis.
Precisely.
Thank you very much.
There doesn't appear to be any other questions. Thank you again. I now call upon Peter Campbell to join us at the table.
Thank you, Chair and councillors. So my name's Peter Campbell. I reside in Surrey Hills. And disclosure, I'm running as a candidate for Maranoa Ward in the current Boroondara Council elections. I strongly support the officer's recommendation on item 3.1. There are copious amounts of documents, as we can see in the materials provided, being released in parallel, but very short or no engagement processes with the community. And I think the Gantt chart highlighted that. I don't support the proposed significant changes to the planning scheme as they stand for the following reasons. Impacts on and outcomes in the Campbell Junction catchment area around the activity centre are ill-defined and unclear. It's unclear how the streamlined planning processes will work. And consequently, I suggest that, or I request that an urgent meeting be sought with the Victorian Planning Minister to raise community concerns about the poor consultation regarding all these changes to the planning scheme for Camberwell Junction. That's it.
That's it. Very prompt. Thank you. Councillors, are there any questions of this submitter? Councillor Sinfield.
Thank you, Chair. Mr Campbell, thank you for your presentation. I was just wondering whether you knew that the City of Boroondara has been trying to get a meeting with the Planning Minister for about 18 months now.
Well, I wasn't directly aware of that, but I'm very pleased to hear that that's the case. Maybe there needs to be some escalation there.
Thanks. No further questions, Chair.
Thank you. There don't appear to be any other questions. Thank you very much, Mr Campbell. I now call upon Jenny Smithers to join us at the table.
Thank you, Chair. Just get myself sorted. So my name is Jenny Smithers and I live in Ashburton, and I'm making this presentation on behalf of Light of Footprints. Light of Footprints welcomes the opportunity provided by the Boroondara Council to be able to participate in the response by Council to the Victorian Government's proposal for the Campbell Junction Activity Centre Plan. So many tongue twisters. Light of Footprints applauds the Council in responding promptly to the State Government's Campbell Junction Activity Centre Plan by its preparation of the two submissions, which we support. This would have required a significant shift of Council resources to be able to respond with such a short time frame. Light of Footprint also applauds Council for giving the community an opportunity to be informed about the Victorian Government's Campbell Junction Activity Centre Plan. Light of Footprint supports the Boroondara Council's submission on the draft Campbell Junction Plan Activity Centre Plan and the submission on the draft Activity Centre Plan and Controls. Light of Footprint notes that the Planning Institute of Australia said in its submission to the Victorian Government that it was troubling that the planning controls for the activity centres made no reference to climate or the environment or efforts to protect new homes from flooding. The plans literally do not mention climate change, let alone consider how these areas need to respond to whole-of-government commitments to adaptation, to mitigation and adaptation. So those issues particularly concern Light of Footprints as a group that is leading advocacy for preparing for climate change. Light of Footprints is concerned about the loss of tree canopy. The proposals for the 800-metre walkable catchment zone from the boundary of the activity centre would mean that there would be no prospect of that area being able to achieve the desired 30% of tree canopy, and the idea that everybody should be able to see 3 trees from their window and be within 300 metres of green space. The loss of tree canopy on private land cannot be compensated by public land tree canopy. As we all know, Burundara already faces significant challenges with increasing its tree canopy due to the loss of tree canopy that has occurred with the Surrey Hills Railway crossing removal and the North East Link Road project, and that most of our street trees are nearing the end of their life. We are also concerned about the lack of detail about the ability for active transport, and I don't have time to expand on that. So we have made a submission to the state government opposing the proposed activity centres and supporting the stand taken by council. And this submission was shared with councillors in wards most affected by the proposed activity centre. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Smithers. Are there any questions from councillors tonight? There are indeed. Councillor Gillies.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ms Smithers, for presenting to us. We appreciate the time and effort put into that. You mentioned that Light of Footprints had written to the Minister. Have you written to other representatives as well, please?
Not to my knowledge. I'm not sure, but...
Okay, maybe that's something you might like to follow up.
Yep, sure.
Thank you.
Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Thank you, Ms Smithers, for your presentation, and I know Light of Footprints are very active in everything that you've discussed and outlined, and thank you for your advocacy. Following along the lines of Councillor Gillies' question, I know Light of Footprints have a good relationship with the Minister, Lily D'Ambrose, and I just wanted to ask if you've sought a meeting with her to discuss this, because obviously she's the Minister for Climate Change, and you know that could be perhaps something you could advocate.
Well, I note that's a good idea. Again, I'm not aware that we've done that, and as noted, this is all coming up very quickly. And
completely understand. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but thank you for that. Thank you.
Councillor Stavro.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your presentation, Ms Smithers. I think a lot of the points you made, you'd probably very hard-pressed to find anybody in this room disagreeing with you among us. My thinking is that, my question, I'm assuming that your committee would have met and formulated your response, and there'd be quite a bit of thought behind all this, and notwithstanding the timeframes. Given what you've just said, what is Light of Footprints' position or thoughts around the fact, how serious is the state government around climate policy? If they're doing what they're doing, and they, as you mentioned, so many drivers that you noted are really going counter climate change, what is the committee's thinking about the seriousness on their climate action?
well, I don't know that I can speak for the whole committee just here by myself. I guess we would, I'd prefer to speak as a person here. I guess there's a dissonance, right? And I think you can observe that at state, local and federal level, that there can be a dissonance with climate policy.
All right, thank you, Ms Smithers.
Thank you. Councillor Franco.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ms Smithers. You mentioned active transport, and I just want to offer the opportunity if you want to expand on that. I don't know if that's a topic you do want to expand on, but...
Well, I mean, it wasn't that I could see a lot of detail about how you'd manage the increased number of people and providing them an opportunity to be able to walk, park their cars if they do have one, charge their cars if they have one, and also, you know, really making it feasible to have people using bicycles and to be able to walk safely and without the problem we're seeing in the city of Melbourne with the, you know, the mobility scooters and pedestrians. So there's really no detail there.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Smithers. That appears to have exhausted the questions. You may return to the gallery. Thank you. I now call upon Yvonne Bauer to join us. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Yvonne Bowyer and I'm speaking on behalf of the Surrey Hills and Mont Albert Progress Association, and I live in Surrey Hills. We are concerned by new information contained in the Office's report titled Victorian Government Activity Centre Proposed Planning Controls. This report mentions that it is anticipated the proposed changes to Res Code will be approved by the Minister by the end of this month. These proposed changes will see new developments in residential zones that, if they meet certain standards, are deemed to comply, and councils will have no option other than to approve them, and residents cannot appeal to VCAT. I spoke at the Urban Planning Delegated Committee meeting held on the 16th of September, and I reiterate our concerns regarding the lack of consultation by the state government. These proposed changes will affect every council in the state, and yet only selected officers from selected councils have been contacted by the state government to provide feedback, and the public has not been consulted at all. We share Boroondara Council officers' concerns about greater site coverage and reduced street setbacks, relaxed standards around overlooking and overshadowing, the removal for councils to consider neighbourhood character when assessing a permit application, and the inability for residents to appeal to VCAT. We appreciate this deficient consultation by the state government has been made worse by occurring right before councils entered caretaker mode. We thank Boroondara Council for continuing to advocate for residents on this matter. We fear for loss of community and the neighbourhood character we value. We believe these proposed changes will result in poorer quality developments and poorer amenity for future residents and neighbours. Thank you for the opportunity to speak this evening.
Thanks very much. Councillors, do you have any questions of this submitter? We don't. Thank you very much indeed. I now call upon Jane Oldham to join us. If you'd like to start with your name and suburb, as usual, thank you.
Good evening, Jane Oldham from Camberwell, and I'd like to thank officers for the opportunity to hear your report tonight, and for the opportunity for our councillors to consider the two submissions that have been made, and for the community to hear the officers' response to both of the consultation documents when our elected representatives are effectively silenced. Boroondara Heritage Group has spoken to hundreds of people in the community since the activity centre and the walkable catchment zone was announced. With heritage, there is deep concern about what could be lost and what could be built that would degrade the precincts and negatively affect their heritage significance, and ultimately whether they will survive as heritage precincts at all. We've got world-class heritage here. Council has invested millions, and councils across Melbourne and Victoria have, millions in heritage advisor reports and enormous resources to conserve this heritage as they are statutorily bound to do. Similarly, the owners of the 4,500 houses currently affected in the Camberwell Junction Activity Centre have made sacrifices to maintain the heritage of these homes. They've invested time, research and their own dollars to maintain them, to conserve them, as they consider themselves the custodians of those places for generations to come, for generations of Victorians, for Melburnians, and for all those people that come and visit. So reading today that there's a 50% loss of heritage in the government model is distressing at a whole new level. Is the government telling us that heritage is no longer of value? It's no longer worth conserving? And I think when we read that it is quite possible to locate the homes for the people that need them within existing areas where council has already identified, it's particularly distressing. If I just turn to the walkable catchment zone itself, no one is anti-building that we've spoken to. Everybody recognises the need for increased density, different types of housing, so that we can welcome new residents, share what is great about Boroondara, and provides greater social and affordable housing. We don't see that this plan as being able to deliver that, though. What it does deliver is enormous uncertainty for the current residents. Anybody that is thinking about residing.
Ms Sullivan, would you like to head towards wrapping up? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I think that in terms of the impact that it's having on people, it will have in the 121 zones around Melbourne is perhaps something that is not being considered by those making decisions.
Thank you. Councillors, are there any questions? There don't appear to be any. Thank you very much for your presentation. I call upon Julie Mulhauser to join us. Thank you.
Good evening. My name's Julie Mulhauser and I live in Canterbury. I was a member of the Victorian Planning Authority's Community Reference Group for the Camberwell Activity Centre and participated in Boroondara Council's workshop for the Camberwell Junction Structure and Place Plan. Thank you for the opportunity to speak in support of the officers' report, and I commend council officers for their work. It is a truism that no one pays attention to the planning scheme until it impacts them. I've reflected on the scale of these proposed changes, both in terms of the degree of change and the number of people who will be impacted, and it is huge on both measures. It is impossible to reconcile this scale with the paucity of detail that has been received to date, despite how late in the decision-making process we are. It is impossible to reconcile the scale with the absence of evidence for the changes, and it is impossible to reconcile the scale with the absence of actions that will result in the stated outcomes. In addition to concerns that these changes will result in negative impacts on public amenity, our built heritage, our tree canopy, flood mitigation, infrastructure and services provision, I'm also concerned about social cohesion. In order to accept change, it is important for communities and their representatives at local government level to participate in the decision-making process and not be excluded, as has happened here. The activity centre changes will result in 6-storey apartments built in low-rise neighbourhoods. These apartments will be more of the high-priced luxury apartments that are currently being built because of the high land price in Boroondara and high construction costs. Why? Because zoning changes don't change the economics for developers. The state government has claimed that these proposals will result in a future where every Victorian can afford a home. There are a lot of Victorians who would like this to be true, most especially the 55,000 households currently waiting for public housing in Victoria. There was an astounding jump of 4,000 households in just the last quarter. Additionally, Boroondara has been identified by Homes Victoria as having one of the highest demands for social housing in the state. I have no confidence that these sweeping changes to the Victorian planning scheme will result in a future where every Victorian can afford a home.
Thank you. Again, councillors, are there any questions of this submitter? There don't appear to be any. Thank you very much for your presentation. I call upon Liz Burton to join us.
Good evening, councillors and officers. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. Liz Burton, Camberwell. I wish to speak on one element only, but before I do that, I would really like to thank the officers and Burundara Council for taking a leadership role, which is really coming across in the media, of analysing the changes, the magnitude of them, and in responding to them in a way that reflects community concern and the welfare and interests of the current community and the future community, which will be impacted by them. So I'd like to speak specifically to open space contribution, given that there will be very little of it, on page 33 of the officer report, where it says that it can be specified in a schedule. However, if it is specified in a schedule, then no contribution is required under clause 53.01. However, we don't know what kind of contribution or how limited that contribution might be. So I think that something needs to be firmed up there because that seems to be far too vague as to the outcome of open space, particularly when you apply this right across metropolitan Melbourne, where it says that no contribution is required under clause 53.01. It does not say that it needs to be at least consistent with that clause. It can be far less. So I think we need, as a council, to respond specifically to ensuring that the outcome is more open space rather than less. Thank you.
Thank you indeed. Again, councillors, are there any questions of this presenter? There are none. Thank you very much for your presentation. Now we have a request, a late request to present tonight, and I will allow it given the interest in this project. Siobhan Khan.
Thanks for the opportunity to speak tonight. I literally came from home 10 minutes ago. I just found out about the meeting, so it's very rushed, but it is really, really important to a lot of people. So my name's Siobhan Khan and I'm from Camberwell. And I'll just basically, because I haven't had much time to put together a submission for tonight, I'll just give you the bullet points for a submission that I've written to the Planning Minister. Also, I'm posting it off to Anthony Albanese tomorrow, and also Sonia Kilkenny, John Pasuto, Monica Ryan and the City of Burundara. I wanted to thank the City of Burundara for the work they've done, particularly the letter from Lisa Hollingsworth, which really pointed out the risks. So I'll just really quickly read out the bullet points without going into the details. So I've read the plan in detail, and the things that concern me are the erosion of democracy. So there seems to be a dystopian removal of our democratic rights. I lose my right. I just think that's absolutely appalling. The affinity for home, neighbourhood and place is something that's universal to people of all cultures and histories. And our homes are our places where we raise our families and where we live. They're not just dots on a map for analysts to look at and consider. It's widely recognised locally and internationally that resident participation in local planning improves the decision-making process. The plan takes a generic and cookie-cutter approach to town planning and completely fails to understand Camberwell's unique attributes. This is evidenced by the fact that the architectural examples put together in the Camberwell plan are exactly the same as on the Preston, Ringwood and Epping plans. In fact, these plans are all based on the same template and almost identical save for the maps, which is appalling given how different these areas are from each other. There is a lack of transparency, consultation and increased uncertainty for residents. The plan reduces Camberwell's future to the status of a pilot or an experiment. This implies that mistakes will be made and allowed. What kind of mistakes? Living amongst characterless grey towers, destroying old homes and butchering beautiful streetscapes. The government has not indicated where this power takeover from council and residents will stop. It feels like the start of a slippery slope and an attack on local government. And that's another thing that really, really disturbs me, is not only the lack of taking away my democratic rights, which I currently have, but this erosion of council powers and authority. That's a real concern. Camberwell Junction is also just a strip of retail shops with a train station and old residential streets, and there doesn't seem to be any compelling argument for the plan. Camberwell is not close to any airport or seaport. There's no manufacturing or industrial areas. It's not close to a freeway or major trucking routes, and no public hospital. I'll wind it up really quickly. The VPA did not consult with the City of Boroondara. The VPA chose to release the plans during the Victorian local government electoral caretaker period. The VPA chose to give limited opportunity to residents for public feedback, and the questionnaire had open questions, which was very unfair. The VPA decided that the community consultation was not required for the junction and surrounds, which I think was absolutely appalling and unfair. There are substantial profits.
Please move towards winding up. Thank you, Rach.
Yep. Okay, population. So the citizenry have never really been consulted on population numbers or growth or anything like that, and I think that discussion has to be had first. And it's a divisive and toxic way of bringing about a plan. There seems to be this difference between this demonisation of NIMBYs, and it doesn't address the housing crisis, and there's the heritage concerns.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much.
We do have some, if you'd like to remain in your seat for a moment, we do have some questions.
Yep.
Councillor Thompson.
Oh, I didn't realise I had the light first. Thank you for your presentation. Would you
Sorry,
mind...
it's last minute.
That's okay. When you send that off, would you mind copying all councillors in?
Yeah, that's fine. Yep.
Thank you.
Councillor Stavro.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for a very thoughtful presentation this evening. Just something that you mentioned a lot of things, but I just ask a question about one thing. You mentioned that hasn't been in consultation on population growth, and I say that only to ask you whether you have any sense as to what their projected numbers are as a citizen, as a normal citizen.
I have heard numbers being bandied around about the city of Melbourne, Greater Melbourne, being something like 8 million people, but my concern is that at no level of government and no political party has had an open discussion around population, and I'm talking about population numbers. We're heading into a climate crisis, and Australians are one of the biggest emitters in the world of greenhouse gases, and I think that we really do need to start having discussions around sustainable population and where does that number stabilise. We just can't keep growing infinitely. It's one planet. So.
Again, thank you for your thoughtful presentation.
Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ms. Khan, for your presentation. You talked about the VBA consultation and questions. You indicated they were open-ended. I just wanted to ask, did you, through the consultation, ask any questions, and if so, have they been answered?
Yes, I did. I contacted the VBA 3 times to ask about who made up the planning. I think it was a planning panel. I think it was page 13 of their guide. I can't quite remember. But I sent them an email and followed up with 2 phone calls and never got a response back. So I wasn't sure whether to do a freedom of information. I thought I'd be very interested to know what that panel was made up of, but it's kind of gobsmacking given the breadth of this plan that there was very little consultation.
Thank you. So no one got back to you, is that
No
correct?
one's got back to me.
Thank you very much.
Chasing up. Okay.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you indeed. You can return to the gallery. That's the last of our presenters this evening, and I will now return to the officers for matters arising.
Thanks, Chair. I'll really only just briefly touch on and acknowledge the submissions by a number of speakers, because otherwise I'll be dragged into much of the detail that I've already covered in presenting or setting up this item. The report this evening is primarily focused on the submission to the head schedule to the activity centre plan. However, it's quite understandable that many speakers have raised issues about other overlapping changes, proposals and plans that will also impact the Camberwell Activity Centre. We plan for Victoria, which is due for finalisation end of December. Council did put a submission in relation to that plan that deals with the population projections for Burundara Activity Centre. So that submission was submitted at the start of September. So that's another consultation that's been underway, but very high-level consultation and not a detailed plan put forward. We expect that to be an impacting plan or overarching plan that deals with the population and housing targets. There have been references to ESD and tree canopy, and they are dealt with perhaps clumsily in some of the Res Code proposed changes, but not in a comprehensive way in the planning system, although indications are that there will be future ESD controls brought in at the end of December. We heard about heritage and the impact or relationship of heritage to any of these new changes, and I think it's quite telling that all of these plans and proposals do not reference heritage and make no comment or statement around the relationship of what these changes mean for heritage. We heard about open space and the concerns raised in our submission around what it means for future open space provision requirements when we deal with application by application, and certainly we are concerned about the lack of clarity around how that works in the schedules to the proposed provisions within the activity centre for the built form. We heard about infrastructure, services, social cohesion and these other issues which are broader planning considerations that, in our view, have not been properly analysed in terms of the impact on a place like Camberwell beyond the activity centre plans and considerations put forward in the Council Camberwell Junction Structure and Place Plan. So lots of uncertainty, lots of unknowns about how these things will relate to each other, but importantly we have, as a council, stepped through submissions on each opportunity to provide a submission. We will continue to do so when we receive the schedule to the activity centre plan that we expect on the 11th of October and work our way through what that means for us and how that can be shaped to being a positive outcome for the future of the activity centre.
Thank you very much, Mr Walker. Councillors, do you now have questions of the officers? Councillor Gillies.
Thank you, Chair. A question and to foreshadow a motion, please, when the time is ready. Mr Walker, we've heard tonight from, I think, all our presenters that they are very concerned, very moved, and the raising of awareness of this matter is something I think around this chamber we all deeply appreciate. What recommendations or suggestions would you offer to the community to keep that momentum going, given that the government survey has now officially closed? What would you suggest people keep doing, please?
Thanks, Chair. Through yourself. It's a little bit difficult for me to go into too much around advocating that residents should do particular things. We don't have a current open public consultation process in regard to any of the current proposals or reforms. So there's nothing open at the moment to lodge a submission to. I would draw residents' attention to our website where we have outlined all of the changes and the different proposals that are put forward, and there are some relevant contacts at the Victorian Government, which I'd say to anyone, you are always welcome to provide comment and feedback to those that are considering and putting forward those controls. And I would say that to anyone at any time, that those opportunities are always there and available.
Thank you.
Okay. We might turn to the CEO now, who'd like to make a comment? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I just wanted to add to the response provided by Mr Walker in relation to the question asked by Councillor Gillies, to say that whilst the formal opportunities for consultation may well have closed, there is every opportunity for our community to write to the Minister expressing their concern, and indeed I would encourage them to do that. In addition to writing to any local members they are able to make contact with. The other point that I think we have of concern here is that there has not been much community awareness at all of this whole initiative, not just in Boroondara but across metropolitan Melbourne. And to the degree that any of our community members are able to make contact with friends and colleagues who might be living in other parts of Melbourne, it would be helpful to draw attention to the fact that this is what's coming their way, so that what we have is a broader groundswell than just Boroondara raising concerns about this, because I think it's really important the government understand the implications we are raising are going to impact people right across metropolitan Melbourne.
Thank you, Mr Storer. Councillor Watson.
Thank you, Chair. Question to officers, and I understand that the focus of the report tonight is on the Camberwell Activity Centre, but there was mention made of 130 other centres that will potentially be identified. And while the question is largely speculative, I guess what I'm asking you is, can you speculate on how many other centres you believe will be identified in Boroondara? And then, in addition to that, would look forward to seconding the motion at the appropriate time.
Thanks, Chair. I can give an indication there. What has been put forward to officers at Boroondara is that Camberwell is one of 10 activity centres that form part of a pilot. And that pilot is to establish the types of controls, method and approach to planning for an activity centre, with a view to that methodology and approach and controls applying to 130 activity centres across Melbourne. So it's been quite open and transparent that that will be the case. We don't know when the balance of those other 120 activity centres will be brought forward, although indications are that there will be another round of pilot or further activity centres early next year. But we don't know which centres will fall within that sort of category. However, and there are indications in the submission that we have provided already that we have no doubt that the likes of Glenferrie and Kew would well and truly fall within that 130 activity centres. And when you take the extrapolation of 800-metre walkable catchment beyond those centres, you'll end up with an overlapping of catchment areas between centres.
A follow-up question, if I may. Based on your response in identifying 2 further areas that have the extended walkable zones around them, could you also perhaps give an estimate of what percentage of Boroondara would be covered once these zones were applied?
Through yourself, Chair, can't really speculate on that sort of percentage. We haven't really done that calculation as yet, and potentially there are other activity centres within Boroondara that may also be affected. We don't know yet. It's a speculation in terms of Kew and Glenferrie, given they are major activity centres at the same level or standing as a Camberwell. But there may be other activity centres affected as well. We haven't done a calculation of what extent would be affected.
I understand. I was fishing for a speculation which you're not prepared to give, and that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr Walker. I've got a few questions here, so I'll try and get through them quickly, and whether you want to jot them down or you may actually not be able to answer them all tonight. But starting with Peter Campbell's question with regard to Burundara reaching out to the various ministers, I just wanted to ask if you could just elaborate that there have been numerous levels of correspondence and attempts to coordinate meetings to no avail at this stage, but we're optimistic that may happen. Then there was a question from Jane Oldham with regard to health and wellbeing, and I know that this isn't a planning-related matter, but it actually made me think of the Local Government Act and Council's commitment to the Burundara Community Plan, where we actually have to comply with the Local Government Act, acknowledgement of the Victorian Charter of Human Rights and Responsibility, and whether or not there is capacity for the impact of community that have purchased, invested, maintained heritage properties as custodians, of whether there could be any consideration to this impact of those people, and particularly 4,500 potentially at risk. So I'm just trying to work out if there's anything that we haven't looked at yet when we've considered reviewing what's been put before us. And the other question was with the submission that we put that was due on the 29th of September. I know Council supported that motion and requested that all the ministers be included in the correspondence. And I just wanted to ask if we have received any response from, in particular, Minister Lily D'Ambrose on the matters of potential impacts to climate with this, or if we've had a response from any minister.
Councillor Hollingsworth, are we sticking within the vein of this meeting?
I believe so. I think it's all relevant to the questions asked.
It's borderline.
All right, but that's all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. A couple of questions there. In regard to reaching out, yes, there has been numerous requests to ministers and various submissions have been forwarded to local MPs and ministers as required and as resolved by Council. I'm not sure that there is any angle in regard to Victorian Charter of Human Rights, in regard to heritage and the heritage overlay. There is no specific change to the heritage overlay. What we need to know in the future is how the relationship of the proposed controls works with the heritage overlay, and obviously we will look at those aspects and considerations when we are aware of how that will play out. We are yet to receive any response to the submission put to the Minister. I think, in fact, the Lily D'Ambrosio submission was, in fact, the Res Code submission, not the Activity Centre submission. I think there was a specific requirement to forward it through the Res Code submission, which has been forwarded.
Thank you. So in that case, no response to that at this stage either? No. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Councillor Franco.
Thank you, Chair. Through you, Chair, when can we make... is there any reason why Council's submissions, the two that we've got attached here, haven't been put up on Council's website, and can they be put up as soon as possible this week or by middle of this week? And in relation to the website, can we add the additional information? I note that at the moment it's very sketchy. It does point out that Council is deeply concerned, but our submissions are not publicly available on the website. They can't be searched, and some of the state government material that we've been provided, a resident would need to search through for our council meeting today, for our UPDC meeting today, to obtain those documents.
Through yourself, Chair. The council report for this evening for the UPDC obviously is now a public document that was made available from lunchtime on Friday. It is now on the public record. Obviously, once we have the council decision this evening in relation to the finalisation of the submission, those two submissions will be attached and included separately and referenced on the Victorian Government website section, or Victorian Government Planning Changes section of our website.
Thank you. And can we also make available the other submissions, the ones on Res Code? And I don't know if there is one on the Victorian Planning Scheme that wasn't touched upon, but It'd be good to be clear on that as well.
Thanks, Chair. There is a link to the report and submission on ResCode, but we'll have a look at the structure and how that works.
Thank you. In relation to one of a question raised by one of the speakers, Peter Campbell, he asked whether a meeting had been sought with the Minister for Planning, and he received a response saying that we've been speaking from my colleague, that we've been seeking a meeting for 18 months. I think it's a very reasonable question, and to be specific, have we sought a meeting with the Minister for Planning in the last month? It's not the last 18 months. The current Camberwell Junction Activity Centre controls were released in mid-August for comment. And have we specifically gone to the Minister and said we want to talk about the catchment zone, and what has the Minister said in relation to a meeting in relation to the catchment zone, which is the area of controversy? And in answering that as well, have we sought a high-level meeting with representatives of the Victorian Planning Authority in relation to the catchment zone in the last 4 weeks, not in the last 18 months?
To yourself, Chair, I would need to perhaps review all of our correspondence to check what was referenced and indicated on multiple occasions. What I can say is I absolutely am aware that on many of the submissions and correspondence that has been sent to the Minister, we regularly request and ask for a meeting with the Minister. So it's not a simple matter of a request was made 18 months ago. Numerous requests have been made on multiple occasions since that time, with correspondence and submissions that have been put to the Minister for Planning.
It would be potentially worthwhile under such circumstances, specifically given the concern with the activity centre, reviewing whether a question has been raised about that in relation to a meeting. My second part of that question was, have we sought high-level discussions with representatives or officers at the VPA, given that they're putting the plan together, rather than relying on submissions through a portal or through more junior officers? And if not, can we do so?
Mr. Storr is perhaps wanting to give an indication, but absolutely, and I have spoken on a number of occasions with executives and executive levels at both the Department of Transport and Planning, responsible for the Activity Centre program, and at the VPA, that are also responsible for putting the high-level plan. So I absolutely have contacted on a number of occasions and have personally spoken with those executives at senior level.
Mr. Storer.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Yes, to confirm what Mr. Walker's just said about the VPA, but ultimately the Minister is the one who makes the decisions. The comment I might make is that the Minister had in fact offered a meeting on October the 24th. That now has been rescheduled until the first week of December. October the 24th was going to be difficult, of course, because of where we are in the cycle, but the meeting in December is one we will look forward to and hopefully have an opportunity to put our case directly to the Minister.
Thank you. Thank you. In relation to the controls that we're still waiting for, in particular the contribution, the public contribution schedule and the other schedule, is it viable for council, and do we have the resources to start developing our own clear proposals now in advance, rather than, say, sitting back and waiting till mid-October or whenever it is for the VPA to release their draft version? It might be worth council considering whether we should at least start putting together what we think they should be in order to be on the front foot. And is that something we've considered, can consider, and have the resources to consider?
Through yourself, Chair, there are various types of matters that are being contemplated by the state government that would change the planning scheme, some of which we have some idea about, some of which we have no idea about the form or structure or approach that will be taken. On a matter like ESD, for example, this council took a lead with 24 other councils to draft controls and put those forward, and we've been advocating for those controls to be considered by the Minister for Planning for a couple of years now. So that's an example where we have drafted our own and taken forward a proposal. We are drafting proposed controls for tree controls, for example, that we will be looking to bring forward. What we don't know is the form and structure of value capture, open space contributions and development contributions. We have no idea about the form or approach or structure. Having said that, we are also underway with a review of our open space strategy and considering different options for considering increased percentages of open space contributions for the municipality as well.
Councillor Franco, does that exhaust your questions? Or?
No, it doesn't. I mean, and specifically, would the director wish to comment specifically on the merit of development? I know council has done all that work and there's a lot of very good work there, but is there merit in specifically looking at these ones? And is that something, I mean, if you don't want to answer now, is that something go away and come back on?
Through yourself, Chair, the development contributions approach is quite problematic. In absence of understanding the form or structure of a development contributions approach to established activity centres, that's not something that would be a viable proposition. We need to understand how it would work. We have no idea how it would work in an established location like Camberwell. So we'll be really shooting in the dark for that sort of scenario or proposal. I was involved in a reference group that 5 or 6 years ago was set up to look at development contributions planned or simplified infrastructure contribution plans, ICTs, for established areas with a view to having a simplified approach that could be rolled out and applied to activity centres across Melbourne. Apparently I'm still on that reference group, but it hasn't met for 5 years. And we don't know what that will look like or how that will work. It just got too difficult. And that's where I hesitate and I say it's quite problematic for us to go shooting off in the dark on how we'd actually build something for established activity centres without knowing the form or structure.
Thank you. One last question, Chair. I can see. Are the catchment areas the same for all the other activity centres or only some? And have we had any discussions with the impacted councils, the other impacted councils, in relation to their concerns? And is there any scope for any joint advocacy work with other councils?
Through yourself, Chair, in principle, the 800 metres applies in all activity centres. In practice, some of the pilot activity centres have a much more refined catchment, but they are quite small centres. So Niddrie and Essendon North, for example, I don't believe has the 800 metres. However, comparable activity centres to Camberwell, whether that's Ringwood, Frankston, Preston, essentially has the same 800 metre methodology and application. It's fair to say most other councils that are within the pilot affected activity centres have significant concern about the breadth, application and impact of the 800 metre catchment.
And just to finalise on this question, can we reach out to them and explore opportunities for joint advocacy?
Through yourself, Chair, absolutely, and we have already joined forces to review various components of the activity centre planning work.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Councillor Addis.
Thanks, Chair.
My question relates to the changes to Res Code and the anxiety, understandable anxiety that some of the presenters have expressed. On page 8, there was a table that talked about the timelines for approval, and it seemed that, so table on page 8 was the one you put up. It seemed that the changes to Res Code were imminent, and that possibly that was just going to be done with ministerial approval, but do we actually know? And how do residents have any sense of surety about how this process will be handled, or for that matter us? How does council have any sense of how it's going to be handled?
Through yourself, Chair, this is one of the difficulties that we have, is understanding exactly what is being put forward, when it is being put forward. The October timeline has come about, or our understanding of the October timeline was as a result of the housing statement in September last year, an indication that the changes to Res Code or Res Code changes would be implemented within 12 months. That brings us through to September of this year. I attended a briefing with a number of other Eastern Region councils in early September where there was a presentation from officers from the Department of Transport and Planning responsible for the Res Code proposals, and they indicated again that this would be the only consultation. The consultation underway with the select councils, this would be the only consultation on the Res Code changes, and that there was no further update to the timeline than what was previously indicated when the housing statement was issued in September last year. And that as far as they're concerned, the timeline remains at October, but of course could be altered at any time or changed at any time. In other words, it's when the minister says go or no.
And it will be totally at the discretion of the minister, who will make that decision without apparently consultation with the community based on what we've seen and heard.
Again, through yourself, Chair, we've been given no indication that there will be any further or wider consultation than what has already occurred. Obviously, that is always open to a change by the government or future decisions by the government, but we're being given no indication of any further consultation. And given the timelines that were indicated and have been indicated, that would suggest that there's not an open opportunity for further consultation. As I say, we don't know. It could change. We could be given some further opportunities, or the broader community could be given those opportunities, but there's no indication of that in the proposals that have been put forward to date.
Okay, thank you. On page 5, there was under 2, there was a point 2. It talks about Plan Melbourne, which 2017 to 2050, which is a actually relatively current new document. Am I right in thinking that's, I thought I read somewhere in the report that's going to be scrapped and this thing will take its place, something, which maybe we don't even know quite what?
That is correct. Plan Melbourne is the current broad metropolitan plan, which is referenced and included within the planning scheme. And what was indicated when the housing statement was issued by the state government in September last year is that they would be developing a new plan that would cover Melbourne, but the new plan would be broader and cover the entire state. So Plan Melbourne will be replaced by Plan for Victoria, and Plan for Victoria consultation ended at the start of September, 2nd of September, in fact, I think was the end of the consultation period for Plan for Victoria. We have received a report and lodge a submission in relation to Plan for Victoria. That dealt with, if you recall, the housing targets that were put forward, and that will be finalised as part of the finalisation of the Plan for Victoria. But what that consultation included was some quite high-level, broad statements around planning principles and objectives. I think 8 big ideas, in fact, they were referenced. Those 8 big ideas are very consistent with what is already in Plan Melbourne. So in a principles and high-level objectives sense, Plan for Victoria does nothing more than what Plan for Melbourne already does, except it will perhaps include specific reference to housing targets on a municipal by municipal wide basis.
If I could just follow up. So in the key directions in Plan Melbourne, in amongst them, it said to create a sustainable city and to increase social and affordable housing. I'm just trying to get, if we think particularly about create a sustainable city, is that being addressed in the Plan Victoria? And I guess I'm puzzled about how we can have a sustainable city based on what we're hearing. Has that been addressed? Because it would seem at odds with decreasing landscaping and increasing density.
Perhaps if I answer that question by going back to Plan Melbourne. There's a lot of the objectives within Plan Melbourne that have wholehearted support of the planning industry and planning community, and in fact the wider community. And principles around affordable housing, around sustainable cities, are absolute high-level, broad objectives and principles that are underpinned by or referenced in planning documents like Plan Melbourne. Part of the biggest criticism that we have as officers of Plan Melbourne is what actually happens in the implementation plans that deliver on the ground those high-level or broad objectives. We have those broad objectives now being repeated at the broader level and the high level in the new Plan for Victoria Big Ideas. References around sustainability and around affordable housing are there again. What we don't know is actually what that plan will look like or how those objectives are going to be delivered. And what we don't have in terms of the planning proposals being put forward to date, the specifics around res code, around the activity centres, what we don't have is those real clear, strong, driving planning controls that will deliver on those broad objectives. We've got an interesting scenario in that the Planning and Environment Act is scheduled for review. Now, that's going to be the last change that the government makes. The second last change is delivering Plan for Victoria. The third last change is delivering the activity centre plans. The fourth last change is delivering the res code changes. That sequence of planning is the complete opposite to what you should do in proper planning. You should start with your review of the Act, then you move to your broad strategic plan for the state, then you move to your important activity centres, then you move to your residential controls and form. You don't do it the other way around, and what we have being rolled out at the moment is the opposite sequence to what good and proper planning is and should be.
So presumably it'll be the last step until they start the whole process again, which is sort of what seems to me has happened with Plan Melbourne. I guess what I'm asking is, do officers feel like this just keeps happening, that as soon as we get some grasp and the community gets some grasp about how this system works, that it's like you're presented with something new again? I guess we know the answer to that. Yeah, thank you.
Councillor Stavro.
Thank you, Chair. And Mr. Walker's characterisation of the cart before the horse sequence just before has probably made a lot of my questions. They might sound repetitive, but I'm going to have a go because I'm thoroughly confused, and I'm happy to admit it in a public forum here. But one question I'll start with, perhaps it's probably the easiest one, and it sort of takes Councillor Franco's question as a demarcation, as I thought he was showing a sequence of deliberate planning and with the various ministers and our interactions. But I want to ask Mr. Walker whether we've had any opportunity to find out about any of these measures, not through direct channels, but through the media in the last few months, in any of the proposals that the government has made.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's we've certainly highlighted in various reports to Council and the UPDC where some of the timing of the announcements have caught us by surprise. Announcements around what our housing target was in the media, not direct to us first. Announcements around the walkable catchment for the activity centre and what form that takes, and the breadth of that and the dimensions of that was in the media before Council was aware and knew about that. So there's certainly some examples of that in recent times. And certainly, again, we've put forward in our concerns in the various submissions about the opportunities for consultation, about the timelines and ability for officers and council to respond and put forward thorough, complete submissions that deal with all of the material before it, and certainly the consultation ability for the community to provide input and respond as well.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. I'll move to my next question. And just in a short, I guess, response, what is the government trying to solve? And I know it's about Camberwell Activity Centre, but I think what we've been discussing thus far has so many moving parts that are all interrelated. So if you give me a little bit of latitude and not just focus on that, please, in your response.
Again, through yourself, Chair, what has been put forward is a housing statement in September last year that purports to respond to the housing crisis. So what is put forward in terms of the subsequent planning changes all point to a response to the housing crisis. That's around housing availability, housing affordability, housing suitability, and the various other factors and concerns that have been raised around housing. So that's what's been put forward as the reasons or explanations and reason for being for those changes. In many of the submissions or positions put forward to date by Council, we question whether those changes will actually do anything to address those housing concerns. So we certainly absolutely raise issues and questions around whether it actually will, or those changes will, affect or impact on housing and the housing crisis that it purports to do. The other thing that we've also raised and outlined quite clearly is that planning for our municipality is more than just about housing. The activity centres are important places in terms of public spaces, in terms of employment, in terms of shopping, in terms of leisure, in terms of community, in terms of services. And this type of planning for these locations is critical in a balanced, comprehensive and thorough way. It's more than just turning the lever on a planning control to say that will deliver more housing and solve all of the concerns.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. So, having heard that, and also Councillor Addis's questions, if Plan Melbourne is the sort of template that's been going back a few years and keeps reiterating and moves forward. And indeed, your answer is that there's a housing crisis and what's the government's responding to. To a certain extent, Plan Melbourne, which was their thought-out plan, has led us to this. Now, one more part to the question. Now that they're putting all these measures forward, where, judging by how many of the responses to Councillor Addis's questions were, and in no fault of your own, you could not answer them because there's not enough information. How confident are we that when they've had certain principles in Plan Melbourne, and we're here now saying that we're responding to a housing crisis, how in the world do we believe that they're going to get the next 20 to 30 years correct by a plan that already has deficiencies that we've been flagged a mile away?
Through yourself, Chair. I'm not sure I quite agree that Plan Melbourne is the cause of the problems that we have before us now. Many of the objectives and principles of Plan Melbourne are thorough, sound and appropriate planning.
Can I say one thing at that? I agree with that. It's actually a well thought out plan, and here we are responding to a crisis, and I'm saying that we're now having something that appears subpar from the beginning. How can we, if that didn't work, how can we be confident with something that's already subpar? Has any chance of working, and can they not see that?
The issue is in the implementation of the plan and what form that takes in the planning scheme, and it also is around what else is done and what else is happening in terms of decisions that might influence and impact on housing. And I think it's been repeated and stated over and over again, simply changing the planning scheme, simply allowing more approvals, simply giving more approvals for housing is not going to deliver the housing. There are so many other factors that are influencing it or impacting on it. What we don't have here is an evidence-based proposal or planning structure put forward that demonstrates what is purported to do is actually going to be achieved or delivered.
So, I might have one more question. There's a lot more that I can ask, but I don't think I'll get any more enlightened as to where we are. But you're a professional in the planning area. Have you been provided with any understanding by the government that it has analysed and understood the causes that we're not where we would have liked to be? Because surely no future planning wants to be in a position where it's responding to a crisis. Have they analysed the causes of failure of where we are now, and are they getting anywhere near in addressing them with what they're proposing?
Through yourself, Chair, I think our previous submissions to the likes of Plan for Victoria go into this in quite a bit of detail in terms of the modelling that's been done to arrive at the 67,000 additional dwellings needed in Burundara and how that's been arrived at, why it is that that needs to occur, how it will be achieved. So there's certainly a whole range of questions that underpin the demonstration of the analysis that's been undertaken and our questions and concerns around that analysis. So that's certainly been outlined in the previous submissions that Burundara Council has put forward. And in fact, we don't even fully understand the modelling that underpins some of the understanding of what housing is needed or how those targets have been arrived at.
No, thank you for saying that. I don't mean that we haven't done that work. What I mean is, and what you've answered is that there's an analysis about the specifics about the 67,000 houses and what's supporting that. I'm actually going a little bit more behind that kind. I'm going to the framework. If we are where we are right now, facing the issues that we're facing as a state, and the government is responding in a way, and your previous response was that there is a lot of good in Plan Melbourne, there are a lot of great principles in there, but something has failed, or many somethings, and you alluded to it, it was the implementation. Has the state government, so I can be more clear...
Councillor, this is getting very close to your previous question.
Well, I didn't get an answer.
It's getting a bit repetitious.
I didn't get an answer.
Can you add
the answer, the question I'm asking is, have they understood, not the specifics, because you're giving me modelling specifics, but from the framework perspective.
Point of order. I just think we need to ask officers questions that they can answer, not asking them to answer for the state government. I appreciate Mr. Walker's attempts, but I think that to be fair.
My question, and the chair can rule on this, but my question is not whether Mr. Walker is going to talk for the state government, whether he's actually received any information along those lines. If the plan has not been analysed, and
I think, Councillor, you've received the answer you're going to receive in that somehow. I don't think there is any further answers.
well, I'm not sure shutting me down is the way to answer that. I'd rather have Mr. Walker say he can't answer it than.
And again, the previous submissions in relation to Plan for Victoria, in relation to the activity centres, is we do not have the evidence that underpins the services, the infrastructure, the planning and thoroughness that's needed for the sorts of changes that are proposed.
Thank you. Councillor Bigger.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Walker, for your forbearance with us. Is the concept of walkable catchment zone based on something that we know of before? Is it something that we've seen before? When I look at this, I'm just wondering whether this has been evident in other areas. So it would give us some idea of where it's headed.
Thanks to yourself, Chair. It actually is. Although it may not be the 800 metres, 400 metres has been commonly referenced, has been commonly used within activity centre planning as a reasonable and appropriate walking distance and catchment area beyond and around an activity centre. So the 400 metres has actually been the guiding principle, and that's applied to many structure plans that have been put together in the past across Melbourne for activity centres. The suitability of a catchment area and the appropriateness of a distance was looked at in a bit of detail for the planning for the new suburban rail loop. And in fact, the distance arrived at for the catchment around suburban rail loop stations ended up being 1.6 kilometres. A distance that surprised many in the planning industry, and in fact, it in fact formed part of a submission that Burundara Council lodged because the 1.6 actually touched around the new Burwood suburban rail loop touched within Burundara and didn't make a lot of logical sense in terms of particular features such as roads that were in that area. The 800 metres, however, we don't have a lot of further information to explain exactly why it ended up being 800 metres in the case of new activity centre planning and why it's no longer 400 metres, why it's half the 1.6 kilometres. We don't fully know, but it's being referenced as a 10-minute walk, comfortable walk to the edge of the 800-metre radius.
And if I might, so then with this 400 metres, then was that also, I know this is not as the crow flies, was that also the same approach to that? So that's not particularly new? Meaning in the 800 metres, they're saying they've not designed that based on as the crow flies, so to speak, correct? Was that the same with the 400 metres? Meaning is it following a bit of a pattern in terms of how this thinking has been applied in the past?
Yeah, the way that the 400 metres, and I'm referencing that as a principle, absolutely has never been applied as a specific 400 metre
catchment.
Specific, that's 400 metres and edged around activity centre. It's been used to then understand what's a suitable and appropriate walkable catchment around an activity centre, and then there is local area analysis and planning undertaken to arrive at what would be appropriate and suitable catchments around an activity centre. And it's not usually also been applied in a prescriptive sense in terms of here's a new zone that applies to the 400 metres. It's actually a strategic planning principle. What's happened in the case of the 800 metres for these 10 activity centres is that a zone is now being put forward to say as a specific zone that will apply in that 800 metres, rather than that being a principle of let's go and examine the suitability of development outcomes and what are the appropriate ways of planning for and applying future development outcomes within that 800 metres. Very different approach. When you say, here's an 800 metres, draw a boundary, specify that, and now say, oh, all of a sudden it's all a new zone with no nuanced analysis and reference to what's appropriate within that for that particular location. That's what hasn't happened here.
Thank you. I'll just ask one more in the interest of time. So continuing on this same line, I guess, do we have any indication that these might, I know in your report you referred to it being probably an overestimation or a sense that these are too large for the number of houses that could be, or dwellings that could be built in that space and would need to be. Do we have any indication or hint that these might be ultimately narrowed, that it's sort of a going wide with the sense that it might be narrowed, or do we really believe that come December this will be what's locked in?
Again, through yourself, Chair, we don't know. We really don't know whether there will be some pulling back of the 800 metres based on the submissions that have been put forward. In discussions with officers of the VPA and the Department of Transport and Planning, the indications to us are that the principle of the 800 metres is a very strong one that the government intends to apply. And that suggests that there may not be an openness to any significant movement shifting or pulling back on that 800 metres, but we really don't know. That's a decision that needs to be made once all of the submissions put forward are reviewed. There is a process that the government is going through with an independent or an advisory panel that has been appointed to review the submissions for the 10 activity centres. That advisory panel will be looking at those submissions on the papers, so there won't be a public forum in which the advisory panel will be hearing submissions from the community or from council, but that advisory panel will be providing a report back to the Department of Transport and Planning and the VPA and the government on their views on the activity centres.
Great, thank you so much, and thanks to all the officers for their fantastic work on this.
Councillor Sinfield.
Thank you, Chair. A significant amount of time has passed since the CEO made a very valid point, but I was wondering if the CEO or the Director of Urban Living might like to expand a little bit more for the community's benefit on the timeline and why we are so restricted at the moment, particularly in relation to the meeting that was scheduled, finally, with the Minister for Planning on the 24th of October, and just expand as to why that can't proceed at that time. Might seem obvious to us.
So the caretaker rules which have been introduced basically say that council, which includes officers, not just councillors, but that council is not able to use its resources during the caretaker period in a way which might influence the outcome of the election. So that's the core, the broad principle, if you like. Now, I guess the iteration of that, which comes about as a consequence of tonight, with this information now being made public in the way that it is that provided a councillor wished to speak in relation to matters which are already in the public domain, largely as a consequence of a council report like this one, then a councillor could do so. But until and unless that information is actually in the public domain, it cannot be used because it would otherwise constitute a council resource not available to the broader community. So you could, after this evening, choose to speak publicly about these matters which are in this report and other reports which have been made available to council now that you've got the complete picture.
As a follow-up, if I may, Chair, just on the point in relation to the meeting with the Minister on the 24th of October, as to why that can't take place at that time.
The Minister did not give us any reasoning. She proposed that date. It was only, I think, last week that we got advice from her department that, her staff, that she wished to move that meeting to December. No reason was given.
Thanks very much. Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be very, very quick. Just picking up on Councillor Franco's comments before about the timeline of submissions that have been put to the various ministers in response to the proposed reforms. Is it possible to actually put on our website a chronological order so that residents that are interested to read submissions reports, any links to what we've discussed since the 2nd of September, is all on one page on the website, so it's very easy for them to reference the material. And so my only other comment was, in this report we have reference to the meeting on several pages on the 3rd of September. It was actually on the 2nd of September. But I think it would be very helpful for our community to just have one site to go to. Thank you.
Thank you. Just through yourself, maybe just to comment on that, we will be revisiting our page that we have set up on the Victorian State Government planning changes and making sure that there are additional links and clear links provided to the various new submissions that are now put forward, but we'll have a look at the order of that and make sure that it's logical.
Thank you. That now appears to have exhausted all the councillor questions. We're now in search of a motion. Councillor Gillies, you didn't indicate you'd be happy to move one.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, the officer's recommendation.
Councillor Watson, you indicated, now that you know what the motion is, are you happy to second that?
I would be delighted to second it.
Can I ask, is anyone opposed to the motion as put forward? It is unopposed. Terrific. Councillor Gillies, keeping in mind that it is unopposed, do you wish to speak to it?
I most certainly do. Thank you, Chair. Thank you. And I would appreciate that slide staying on. Thank you. Thank you to the officers. Firstly, my sincere thanks and appreciation to Mr Walker and all the officers who have undertaken as deep an analysis as possible under extremely tight timelines and, frankly, a significant lack of explanation from the State Government Planning Department as to how these changes are going to play out in reality. Also for the detailed responses to tonight's questions. Thank you again. That's been very helpful, I think, for a lot of people. Also, I'd like to thank the many people within our community who have helped raise awareness of these proposed changes. People have made contact, they've written to elected representatives, they've asked questions, and they've attended public forums to try and seek an understanding of these very complex matters, but which will have great impacts across our whole municipality. However, as we've heard the CEO suggested, please keep communicating and raising awareness of this issue as it has effects far and wide across Melbourne, not just Burundara. We currently have 70,000 dwellings in Burundara. The state government wants to add another 67,000 to this by 2051. That's about 3 times the current development rate. And that's an example of the levels of development that much of Melbourne will be facing. But to the matter before us tonight, this is not just about the Camberwell Junction, nor is it truly about resolving the housing crisis. The proposal only refers to general discussions on the housing matter, offers no real solutions, and is nothing more than a collection of broad motherhood statements without considering important planning issues for good growth. In short, this is an ad hoc approach to rushed planning reforms that creates a complex and disjointed system that is actually counterproductive to housing delivery. And Mr Walker just referred back to some of that complexity a minute ago. Now, these proposed changes to the Camberwell Activity Centre and the relevant Res Code planning controls serve to severely undermine, even destroy, much of what people have fought for, treasured and accomplished in this municipality. Generic controls result in generic outcomes that don't respond to local context. What we will see is a loss of tree canopy, significantly reduced permeable surfacing and increased pressure on already strained roads, stormwater and waste management systems. We've got drains at the hill end of Prospect Hill Road that struggle with downpour now, not even at the bottom. These changes will simply take the whole municipality down a path of lowering standards in the guise of fast-tracking housing availability. The vast catchment area extending out from the junction area is illogical and not strategically justified. It encompasses approximately 10,800 properties within that red border for anyone looking at the screen, of which about 4,500 are in heritage overlays. No details been provided as to how this new catchment area will operate with heritage overlay. There are locations within Boroondara that can absorb development with scale and intensity without disproportionately impacting the character and amenity of established residential areas. Local councils should be the responsible authority to consider character, heritage, landscape, the impacts on neighbours and the environment of a proposed development. Council and its officers are ready to discuss in an open and transparent process a more strategically justified and appropriate response to the future growth of Camberwell Junction and indeed the whole municipality. We sincerely seek the Victorian Government support a well-founded and researched Council-adopted Camberwell Junction structure and place plan, the blue part of that map, and remove this additional 800-metre catchment area that they want to extend out to, that red line. I commend this motion to my colleagues as a show of this council in a united response to express our community's deep concerns and resistance to these state government proposals. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Gillies. Mindful that this is unopposed tonight, and also mindful that we're undergoing a statutory process outside this chamber, I'm really not comfortable in offering other comments tonight. So I would prefer to move, unless there's a howl of disagreement, we move directly to putting the motion. I now put the motion. Those for, in favour? Those against? I think it is carried unanimously. Thank you very much indeed. We can now move on directly to general business. Councillors, are there any matters of general business? There are none. Urgent business? None. Confidential business. Councillor, are there any items of confidential business? There are none. Before I close this meeting, I want to thank all of you who have joined us this evening, and I declare the Urban Planning Delegated Committee meeting closed. Thank you.